Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to this nice conference here in the nice weather of South Italy. It was quite a change coming from Germany, I can tell you. Anyway, yeah, it's interesting that I ended up in artificial intelligence. My background is actually very different. I originally studied physics, actually. I have a master in physics. But then moved towards computer science and specifically computer graphics at the end of my studies, and did my PhD in computer graphics together with Hans-Peter Seidel, who's now at the Max Planck Center in Saarbrücken, and as you just mentioned, was visiting assistant professor at Stanford, and I hold the position of a chair of computer graphics at Saarland University, and then 11 years ago I was invited to join the DFKI because the work we're doing is very, at least I believe, and currently others believe as well, there's a lot of connection between what we're doing and AI, and I want to present that to you today. Yeah, I lead a group of about 40 people at the DFKI. It's called the Agents in Simulated Reality. But I'll give a quick introduction into DFKI first, just very quickly. Then I'll talk about what we call digital reality, which is this mix of computer science and simulation, essentially using AI to optimize and safeguard other AI systems. I'll give some example applications we're working on. I won't go into too much details there. I just want to give you the ideas, particularly in the context of autonomous driving. And then I'll look into yet another area a little bit more where we use this as well for optimizing measurement processes, another area where we're quite active before. So the Saarland Informatics Campus is actually somewhat similar to the campus here. We have the university, 17,000 students, which is like a mid-sized university in Germany. We have the two Max Planck institutes on campus for informatics and for software systems, which obviously work more on the fundamental research side, and we collaborate with them quite a bit. The FKI then is more application-oriented and focused on AI, of course. And the thing that really sets us apart in Saarbrücken, I think, is that these institutions, though they're very different in terms of structure and organization and focus, they are working together really, really well. And one of the results of that is the Center of Excellence on Multimodal Computing and Interaction. It's been going on for roughly 13 years now. And also out of that came a new Helmholtz Center for IT Security, which will grow to 500 or 600 people. Researchers. So this is quite a big place in Germany, and within this, just to give you a quick idea, this was computer science about 12 years ago, and since then we've essentially built another building every year for computer science, and we're actually planning a couple of more right now. So there's a lot going on. So what is the FKI? I guess most of you know, but just for those who might not, quick overview. The German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence were founded in '88, so 31 years old. We just talked about AI winters. It actually is, it's interesting. While there were winters more on the academic side, actually we've been working, essentially building tools for industry, and there hasn't really been much of a winter in this context, because tools and practical things that people can apply is actually needed every time, always. As far as we know, we're still the largest AI research center of its kind, despite the big investments in China and the US. We have now, we're growing, we have now 6 sites, Saarbrücken, where I come from, right on the French border in the west of Germany, Bremen and Kaiserslautern, Berlin, Osnabrücken, Oldenburg are also the sites we have 18 largely independent research areas. Again, agent and simulated reality, the group I lead is one of them. We have 10 competence centers, which are kind of cross-cutting. For instance, for deep learning, we have one for autonomous driving and more. And we have a number of living labs where we use the technology that we develop to kind of really show this in practice for industry. These are typically setups, demonstration centers, if you want, that typically we create in close collaboration with industry. About 50 million per year of funding. We have no base funding. All of that funding comes in through projects, either for publicly funded or a lot now, particularly lately with industry, much more than it was before. And quite a number of spin-offs. We are actually not a public organization. We're a private organization, a non-profit GmbH under German law. And our shareholders, besides the universities and the local states, are essentially industry. The logo's a little bit washed out here. Anyway, you kind of see most of that. So it's big companies, but also smaller companies from the financial industry, from the software industry, from agriculture, a lot from the car industry. Of course, there's a lot of interest. And we just handed out about a dozen or so new shares last year. They're already all gone. There's something you might not know. We have actually changed our CEO recently. 2 weeks ago, Antonio Krüger, who I guess a lot of you will know, has now become the new CEO. And we have a collaborative leadership now where the heads of the local sites, the site directors of Saarbrücken, Kaiserslautern, and Bremen, we form one big team. And this is working out really great, so I really like this setup. We have a total of 29 professors, so all of the scientific directors at the FKI are also professors at the local university, so we have a very, very strong link between what we're doing, research in the FKI, and what's happening on the academic side. Maybe this is also interesting. So we're not typically doing this blue sky basic research, how some people call it. Our focus really is on the applied research here in the center. We sometimes go back increasingly more in the last few years on what we call application-inspired basic research. So we want to do an application, but we find out there is fundamental technology missing, and so then we go back and we do whatever is needed to do our applications. And then, of course, we do a lot of transfer, but we're not doing the commercialization or the exploitation. We leave that to our industry partners, spin-offs, and other partners that we work with. We're very international. About a third of our staff is from all over the world, including Italy, of course. There's quite a few people from Italy. Another thing that we've been doing increasingly in the last few years is not just help the FKI, so to say, but really try to engage much more with the community at large in Europe. So CLAIR, which was just mentioned, which is the Confederation of Labs for AI Research in Europe, has been founded summer last year because AI in Europe, but even within some countries, as we also discussed, has been very fragmented in the past. And we kind of got the inspiration from physics, right? They got big centers like CERN, and that was only possible because they joined force all across Europe. And so that is what we are striving for. So the core team of the founders, of co-initiators, is myself, Holger Hoos from Leiden University, and Morten Jürgens. We by now have about 3,000 experts and stakeholders supporting CLAIR. We have a number of offices, and there is an increase of, including Rome, by the way. Paris is joining now, and there's a couple more in the pipeline. We are already officially supported by 9 European countries, and Germany and France, which are prominently missing here. They recently gave very good signs that they will join us as well. The structure that we're aiming for is really this kind of joint structure where at the bottom, hardly visible here, there's a fine network here in the past, in the back, is a network of AI research labs. We have over 330 by now, and weekly we're getting more. If your lab is not part of that, I encourage you to contact us so we can really get all of the AI labs in Europe to work together. There's an internal communication structure now in place that it's getting more and more attention and more use now. At the next level, the goal is to establish key centers, networks of centers of excellence. There obviously was the ICT 48 call by the European Union, not very much money, but essentially to create this structure. They call for 4 networks, which is stupid, but right, we need 1 network and not 4 parallel competing networks. But anyway, this is what the call was, and we've, as Claire, we applied for the coordination of that, and hopefully we already worked with a lot of those applicants that created proposals, such that at least those that we are aware of, and they contacted us, they are well coordinated among each other, so we don't create competition, but actually collaboration. So this is pretty much underway. There's obviously much more we can do. And then we're getting very encouraging feedback now for the last step, the 3rd step, which is this, I like to call this the CERN for AI, because politicians get this like in the first 2 seconds. Everyone knows CERN, everyone knows that CERN is probably the best and most prominent success story of research in Europe, right? The entire world in physics, at least in particle physics, moves and wants to be there, wants to be part of that, wants to run experiments there and so on. And I think there is the need for, first of all, for practical reason, to have a center where we can come together. I mean, there's big projects. We're really good in Europe, but we don't have the scale. Each of the individual institutions are great, but there's certain things we can't do yet. And I think we need the infrastructure to do this. And also we need a symbol for the AI, for our ambition and excellence in AI. And that would be the first such center worldwide. So I think this is actually a good story, and it would be very helpful for everyone. We're very interested and very active now to create an industry network and also innovation network. But this is work in progress. We're just starting. There's a lot of interest from industry already. Here's a couple of companies we have talked to already, and of course there's many more. And this will be kicked off as soon as Claire is officially incorporated, which is underway right. Which is really something, so a lot of other people recognize this, most prominently ESA, the European Space Agency. We've done some very interesting projects with them and essentially developed a strategic research agenda for AI in Earth observation or space industry in general. I hope it can be read here. So this is Mr. Werner, who is the head of ESA, and there's a strong collaboration. And ESA decided to put a lot of money there, so there's actually calls out for AI in space industry by ESA now. And we want to do that for many other areas as well, together with industry in particular. Okay, so after this introduction, what are we actually doing? My group, and there is one big topic that I'll talk about in a second, but just give you a little bit of background. So my group, again in Saarbrücken, we're trying to bring together AI, graphics and simulation, this is my background, as well as high performance computing, which is needed to do a lot of those things. And we focus on these application areas, autonomous driving, computational science, so using AI in other sciences, smart living, so everything between smart home and smart city. Industry 4.0, of course, is one of the core topics of DFGI and high performance computing. And a lot of you might know Klaus Fischer or Matthias Klusch and maybe some of the other people in my group. So what have we done? So for instance, this is the steel mill in Völkling, not far away from us. This was actually a basic research project using multi-agent systems to essentially do the entire control of the steel mill. This is an older project by now, but this has been running over 10 years, over 12 years now, 24/7. It's a multi-agent system that drives an entire factory, and we're very happy about this. A great success. More than 5 researchers actually moved over, maintaining this now in the industry. We're actually not involved anymore. But that's a really nice thing. So more on the graphic side, but I'll come back to that, how that is relevant for AI. We've done a lot of work on real-time ray tracing, a rendering technique, which is now being used by Intel, by NVIDIA, AMD and others. From the ray tracing team at Intel, 2/3 of this actually come from my group, and in my sabbatical I started off the ray tracing activities with NVIDIA. We do a lot of lighting simulation, and again I'll come back why this is relevant for AI, which is used entirely in the film industry now. And I'm most proud of a paper that we did in 2005 at SIGGRAPH, which is our top conference with 20,000 attendees and so on. And there we presented a hardware architecture for ray tracing. And funny enough, last year, end of last year, NVIDIA decided to put a similar hardware block into every GPU they're producing. Every high-end GPU, they have a low-end version now that does not have this. Anyway, so there's a lot of work there. We do, besides building hardware, we're doing a lot of work on compiler technology, right? Because there's no way yet to write a program and run it on CPUs and GPUs and FPGAs with top performance. We have a solution for that we're using now and improving. We actually do a lot of applications of AI. I mentioned this computational work here with other sciences. This is actually a lot of work we're doing with material sciences to understand that micro and nano structure in materials when you mix different metals and others, not a homogeneous mixture. It's actually building 3D structures, and how do you understand that, and how do you understand how this 3D structure at the micro and nano level actually, how that affects the macroscopic properties of materials. This is a really important going forward. So we're using AI, a lot of AI in this context. But also in life sciences, and I'll talk about some of this work here in electron microscopy as well. We do quite a bit of work on intelligent human simulation. I'll talk about some of that. This is in the factory setting with Daimler. There's a large EU project about that. We work human-robot collaboration. There's a big project with Volkswagen and Airbus. And we do, as I mentioned before, do quite a bit of work on autonomous driving, and then I'll go dig deeper in this because I think this is really a very interesting area. And in this context, we've developed this, this approach of what we call digital reality. Essentially using AI to optimize and safeguard other AI systems. So I want to spend more time going through this. I guess many of you have probably seen this image. This is the woman with a bike that was hit by an autonomously driving car by Uber 2 weeks or so ago. After 18 months of investigation, we found out, we kind of knew before, but they kind of now have the proof, that this person, which had crossed 4 lanes, has been seen by the sensors of that car for over 5 seconds, almost 6 seconds. That this AI system was incapable of recognizing that person. Right? That's a problem. Right? In particular, that person was killed because it was hit by the car. The car didn't stop, it didn't try to avoid that person, it decided that person isn't there. That's a problem. And but even more problematic is that the entire research and the development team that created that AI didn't know that their AI system was not capable of handling a not uncommon situation, right? I mean, it was dark. It wasn't actually that dark, but anyway. And I think that's a problem, right? If we build AI system that kill people because it is kind of stupid, if you want, or at least unpredictable in what it does, we're in big trouble. So what turned out is that AI system only recognized people if they crossed the street at pedestrian crossings. Right? I mean, that's a major mistake, I think. Anyway. So we have to create AI systems, we have to safeguard AI systems, we have to make sure that they do the right thing, right? And for that, we have to measure this. And so how do we do that? I mean, first of all, there's this big complexity that we have, right? I mean, our world around us is really complex in terms of geometry, in terms of how that geometry appears, of lighting, of motion, of weather phenomena, right? A wet street looks very different than a dry street, a complex environment. And despite this huge complexity out there, right, we need to build AI systems that reliably make the right decision, right? If a kid runs in front of a car, which happens, luckily not too often, right, we really want to make sure that this car, right, does all it can to avoid hitting this kid, or at least slow down, or whatever is possible to do in this situation. And something like we saw before, right, we have to avoid this as much as possible. Now the problem is, luckily, we're not hitting too many kids. And so we don't have data about this, hardly any, right? That's a good thing. And right, a lot of the car industry for a long time, I've been on a conference actually yesterday, and they still talked about how many millions of miles do we have to drive to make cars safe, autonomously driving cars safe, right? If you think for 2 seconds about that sentence, right, essentially what this is saying is, right, how long do we have to drive until we've hit enough kids that we have enough data to avoid hitting them in the future, right? I hope that we all agree that this is the wrong way of developing autonomous cars, right? So we need to find other, and we don't have data, right? So there is a big problem. And the only way out of that, I think, and I've talked to a lot of people in the meantime, is we have to use synthetic data for making this work. And there's a couple of other reasons as well. So essentially the idea is to do virtual crash tests, right? All of the cars today, they're crash tested before they're allowed to go on the street, and almost all of this crash testing is done virtually in the computer today. They just crash a car or two at the end to verify that the crash testing they did in the computer actually is a valid representation of what happens in the real world. And another example is, right, we would never let any pilot fly a passenger airplane until this passenger, in dozens and dozens of hours in a flight simulator, has shown that he or she can handle any emergency situation that might come up. Okay? Otherwise, we will not let them fly. And I think that's a good thing, and that is what we want to do for cars, or actually AI systems in more general. So what's the problem? The problem is that we have these long-tail distributions where, right, there's certain situations we see all the time. Right, you're driving through a city, there's a street, there's parked cars, there's walkways, there's persons, there's houses. After so many miles or whatever, you have seen enough of that, right? You will not learn anything new, right? And we can learn for real data because we have plenty of that, right? But at the far end, and that's probably can go on for a lot more here, this is just symbolic, right? We have these critical situations like kid running in front of a car. And of course, there's many, many more. Very, very low probability. We don't have data, and so the only option here is synthetic data, because then we can generate exactly that synthetic data that we need to verify that our AI system will do the right thing. But it's not isolated situations, but let's say for a kid running in front of a car, right, there's obviously many possibilities, right? Large kids, small kids, from left, from right, fast and slow, day and night, with rain and snow and so on. So we need to really generate entire family of variants of that at different places in the city and so on. So obviously what the car industry has been doing for a long time is testing cars in reality. This is really expensive, it's costly, and doesn't really scale, in particular for those rare cases. So what the car industry has already recognized and is adopting is testing cars in a digital reality, right? Now, funny enough, if you look at what they are using, is they use game engines. Actually, the very first paper in this area, they used GTA 5, which is a car racing game, to generate images that they then used for training semantic segmentation. It looks great for gaming, but if you look at how people are moving and how the environment looks like, it's not very realistic. And so training a car on something that is not realistic is probably not very helpful. And just to give you an example why this is so, that this won't work, We all are aware of these situations where you're driving along a road, a pedestrian approaches the street from the side, and the big question that we need to solve is, does that person stop, or do we have to brake, right? And I think if you're anyway like me, we never think about that. We just know whether that person stops or not, right? Sometimes it's eye contact, but often it's not. It's this a very subtle change in the motion of that person that tells us, oh, this guy is slowing down. But I would guess no one of you knows what exactly makes that difference between stopping and not stopping, right? We're not aware of that, we just know, right? And so it's very hard for a artist, let's say, to animate a person like that. And so this will not be in this digital reality, and it is not in this. They use game characters, and they move not very natural, let me tell you. Okay, so how can we solve that with the use of AI? So it's a four-step process that we're proposing in this digital reality. The first step is we go out there, there's plenty of data out there about reality, and we build what we call partial models. It's the rules of the games, right? If you think in AlphaGo Zero, for instance, right? AlphaGo Zero had the advantage the rules of the game were known, right? Essentially, we want to do the same thing. We want to train an AI system on a simulation, except that our simulation is much, much more complex than simulating Go, of course. So here we're building models about different aspects of the world, like the motion of pedestrians. So we focus a lot of pedestrians right now, motion of pedestrians, but also behavior of pedestrians, but also, right, many other aspects. How do streets, how does the environment look like, what are typical environments, arrangements of things. Around that, how do other cars behave, what do bicycle drivers do, and so on. Funny enough, there is large scientific community outside of AI that already address this, at least to some degree, but they don't use it for AI. So I think there's a lot that we can import that we can use in AI to go forward. Once we have these models, we can define these scenarios that are relevant or even critical for the correct functioning of the AI system, so in this case, an autonomous car. Actually, the car industry has long catalogs of critical scenarios, okay? If we could just handle them, this would be a huge step forward already, but there's also work underway to automatically define new critical scenarios, or to analyze the situations and identify more of them, right? Essentially make the catalog more complete. So once we have these scenarios, then we have to create variations of those scenarios. As I said, big kids, large kids, small kids, tall kids, short kids, left, right, and so on. But this is easy, right? Because we have a model, right? So we can essentially do Monte Carlo sampling of this space. Yes, it's a high-dimensional space. There's all sorts of problems associated with this. But this can be done, right? You can very easily generate many variations. Now, we never know whether it's complete, right? So this is where we can't do verification with any of this, but validation is equally good, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. So we have all of these variations and instances of scenarios, and so the next step is to simulate them. To simulate how the kid actually walks in front of the car, what the other cars are doing, and so on. But we also need to simulate the sensors of the AI system. So in this case, we want to generate the data that a real car with its real specific sensors on that car would see if it were in that situation. Okay, so we need to simulate the sensors, we need to simulate the environment in that scenario. And then we have the data that the real car would see, and there's a number of things we can do with this. First of all, we can use it for training. There's a couple of papers now that show this actually can benefit training of AI systems, specific the perception part of this, but we can also go further. There's papers about that as well. We can also use it for benchmarking because we can recreate exactly the same scenarios and can look at whether our AI systems got better since last week or last month. So benchmarking is really important. But most of all, the most interesting and most relevant question for me is, how can we use this to validate AI systems, right? by essentially exploring that parameter space of possible situations, hopefully intelligently, that we can be at least doing a statistical analysis, right? If from all the possible situations that are there, we do stochastic sampling in the easiest case, and we see that after a while we don't learn anything, right? Then we can be reasonably sure that we have covered that area, right? Again, we cannot guarantee completeness, but that would be a huge step forward already. And there is actually now first work underway to link, so here at the top, reasoning is really important for a lot of these often logic-based reasoning methods. There is actually verification techniques available. So it's really, we can do verification together with validation. I'll come back to this in a second. The last step of that is we need to validate what we have learned in this against reality, right? We have to make sure that we didn't miss anything. But we have to do this anyway, right? So first of all, right, we can see if we present our AI system with real data, right, we can find out what did that AI system understand, or are there situations or parts of the environment the AI system does not understand, right? So it would have low confidence of recognizing, or it would quickly change what it's recognizing. So my example is always, right, if the car sees a kid doing somersaults on the street, maybe we have not modeled that, right? But it would tell us, oh, now it's a kid, no, I don't know what it is, then it's a kid again, right? Because if it's upright, maybe it recognizes as a kid. Anyway, so there is good ways to, and all of this needs more research, of course, but there's ways to find that out. We would record that data, and we can use this to improve our models, to make them more complete, which is all very useful. We have to do all of this anyway, right? Because even if our models were perfect, right, and complete, the world around us changes, right? Last year there were no of these rollers, whatever the right term is, right? We have to add them now, right? And we would recognize that there are things that we need to add. Now finally, I explained all of this in the context of autonomous driving, right? But there's nothing specific to autonomous driving. The only precondition to do this is that we need to be able to model the environment reasonably accurately. So what do you see in the lower right-hand corner? Yes, that's the typical example I get. A person walking. No, you're completely wrong. What you're seeing is a couple of white dots moving on a black background. Are we in agreement about this? Yeah? But that's exactly my point, right? There is a minimum in information in this small rectangle there. But every one of us in this room immediately saw a person walking. And it goes even beyond that, right? If you would know that person that this data comes from, you would, with very high probability, be able to identify who that is. And even more astonishingly, and I only learned this a couple of weeks ago, if this were data from yourself, you would recognize yourself, even though, for very obvious reasons, you never see yourself walking. So we have a very, very good understanding about our own body, that we can even recognize ourselves if we see ourselves from outside of our body. So our human visual and understanding system is extremely sensitive to very, very subtle and very little information. Right? And as far as I can tell, there is no AI system that can even get close to that. But I think through that mechanism that I just presented, we can go a lot in this direction, and that's what we're actually doing. Here's one of our current experiments. This is actually from the University of Saarbrücken. There's a street, students mostly, are walking along the street for two different reasons. The one is there's a bus stop up here, and the students walking there, they sometimes have to look backwards whether the bus is coming, because then they have to start running. And students are often late, not only students, but anyway. So that's one reason why they want to look backwards. But there's also a pedestrian zebra crossing here. And some of the students want to cross, and they want to look backwards whether a car is coming, right? So they do the same motion. And actually, so here's measurements, motion capture data. If you look at the blue curve here, which is the head rotation, right? It's exactly the same whether they look for the bus coming here in this left case, or whether they want to cross the street. So the head motion is more or less the same, right? However, the person who wants to cross the street actually starts rotating the hip and the shoulders, okay? So there's a very, very clear signal here, which is very different between the two scenarios. Now what we're working on is exactly by using this capture data, building motion models, very accurate motion models of human pedestrians, such that we can create essentially arbitrary amounts of training data for different persons. We have models that can have female motion, male motion. Actually, motion is very female, and male motion is very different. And also lots of variations in motion. There's something we're working on to essentially train this. So I can't report on the results of this. This is ongoing work. But this is essentially only something we can do because we can synthesize that motion. Otherwise, it would be a huge data problem here. Another example, and this comes back to what I did mention at the beginning, is that, right, since these autonomous cars have very different sensors, right? There's cameras. We reasonably well understand how image generation works, and so if we can simulate the environment, we can generate very realistic images, even taking into account the complexity of cameras and real cameras and so on. LiDAR is even less well understood, reasonably, but there's still a lot of open questions. And radar, there's a lot of open questions. Essentially, there's no good radar simulation, at least for this case. And so we're now working with the car industry to essentially do radar rendering. Now, radar rendering is actually quite a bit more complex because the wavelength is longer, it's coherent light, right? It's electromagnetic waves. And it has a very different focus. So we're actually interested, so for typical optical rendering, we're interested in the diffuse colors and not on the highlights like reflections and highlights that you see in many other objects. But that is, these highlights are exactly what the radar systems are looking for, because there's a very high level of noise there. And the diffuse parts are essentially, they scatter light in all directions, which is what we optically are looking for, but they're dispersing energy, and so the diffuse reflection essentially vanish in the noise level. So there's important work right there now to actually be able to synthetically render radar images in order to then use that for training autonomous cars. And the main reason for us to do this is that we want to do early fusion between camera data, radar data, and other data, and we can only do this if we have realistic radar data. And this is really hard to come by. And so there's 3 SIGGRAPH papers we got this year working on this, and our compiler technology is being used there. So this is a larger effort. But maybe coming back to topics that are a little bit closer to AI, this is another work that Matthias Klusch in particular has been doing. And this is a little bit washed out with the fine detail up here, so let me just quickly go through this. This is an application where I mentioned that we need reasoning and learning and bring these two things together. So in this case, we're doing essentially driving simulation over here. We link that to an AI system that has a path planner, a belief tracker here to understand what is in this environment. And then here we do the AI processing about to decide whether we should accelerate, brake, steer, and so on. And this is essentially, there's different approaches how you could do that. We actually, in this work here, we took an online POMDP planner that as one case, right? We used a reinforcement learning system so essentially a deep learning approach to do that. And then in this high leap system that we build is we combine the two things together. So POMDP is essentially some sort of a decision tree, and essentially which you can see here, but the decisions within each of those nodes, this is where we do the deep learning step, which is in a network, which is hardly visible here, which kind of updates our decision trees as we go, as we kind of do those simulations. So it's really a very interesting connection where you have this more symbolic aspect here of this decision trees, but we use deep learning to kind of learn exactly what those decisions should be in that entire system. So we have like limitations and constraints that come from the tree, so we have a much better understanding. This also helps with better understandability of the AI system. That's an area we're going to do more. So you can look at the paper here. And we actually evaluated this system on very concrete and standard test scenarios. There's the GIDAS, which is a collection of standard scenarios from traffic scenarios. So here you see some of the examples. So this is essentially about pedestrians, so car-pedestrian crossing in various situations while you're turning. Also like different distances of where pedestrians are crossing. Or here, zigzag movement of a pedestrian. That is exactly where you want to know, is he crossing or is he not crossing? Also like distances of multiple people crossing. And so one of the problems, for instance, of deep learning with pedestrians, we did quite a bit of work on this. So we did deep learning on recognizing that a pedestrian is crossing the street, and we trained this on a single pedestrian, right? And then we used that. It actually worked pretty well. And then we had two pedestrians crossing the street. And as you maybe can expect, if you think about this a little bit, is what this deep learning network learned was, oh, there's a pedestrian crossing, I need to stop, right? But once I've passed that pedestrian, I can accelerate. That is what the system learned as well. And now if you had a second pedestrian cross right after that, it was getting conflicting information. It said, oh, I learned that I can now accelerate, right? And what it did was most of the time it hit that second pedestrian, right? So it doesn't generalize as well as you think it should be, right? You would think, oh, it has learned to stop when there's a pedestrian. Yes, but it also learned that it can accelerate after that. And that obviously is in conflict with many situations. Of course, you should have learned with many people, but that's more difficult. We could do that in virtual space, but these are traps that you have to think about when you do this kind. And it's very hard to miss that case, right? If we hadn't done these experiments, we might have thought, oh, this is really good at avoiding hitting crossing pedestrians, but in the real situation with the second pedestrian would still have killed people. So we need to test and validate our AI system. So how did that system, this high leap system that I just described, how did that actually fare? So here's the two individual cases. There's some other technology. We also looked at various statistics here. But the real story is that these combined system was much safer. It avoided many more critical situations and crashes than the individual system, while roughly being equivalent to many of the other criteria that are used in this context, right? So how fast you are, right? You can drive really slowly, but then you're not hitting one, but that's not the goal. So there's many other aspects you're looking at. Yeah, I want to quickly also come back to this verification versus validation. So, right, verification is really good in a top-down sense, where you have a formal description, maybe logic-based or whatever, and it can't be too complex, right? Because then a lot of the tools can't deal with arbitrary complexity. So verification is really good in this scenario. Validation, on the other hand, is very good if you have very concrete data. It can deal with very complex situations, but it doesn't guarantee completeness and only gives you statistical results. Right? Which is good in many cases, right? I mean, I guess there is no formal proof that the ceiling will not break down in the next hour. But there's good validation that given the finite element system that we use to analyze the load and stuff, probably not formally verified. We trust these things. They're essentially validated by engineering. So it's not as bad as we often think. I mean, as an academic, of course, verification is very appealing, but we don't always need this. And these two steps really are often seen as contradictory. And I think we need to change this. So we really need to look at how can we combine verification techniques at the top with validation techniques at the bottom. How can we connect these two, right? If you can prove that the kid is 500 meters away from the car, right, there's no need to do any validation, right, because we can prove nothing can happen, right? Just as a very, very trivial example. So verification, for instance, can at least make a lot of use for avoiding doing testing in scenarios where this is not necessary to steer us to the critical cases in these high-dimensional spaces and a lot more. So this is part of work we're doing. So really, we want to find this path and combine verification and validation. So it's not verification versus validation, but really verification and validation combining these techniques. And there's a couple of collaborations we're doing to kind of look into it. So actually, giving timing, I'll skip this part. I'll make the slides available. Very quickly, this is about electron microscopy. Just very quickly, the results. Essentially, the trick is, in electron microscopy, you can either invest a lot of time on scanning a single point, and then you get good results. It's a statistical process. With many electrons, then you get a good image at that, a good pixel without errors. Or you can be fast, and in many cases you want to be both. And what actually happens is, instead of scanning the entire picture, we can avoid taking all of the pixels at full accuracy, but use more time to scan each pixel that we do scan. And really the interesting part, let me just skip all of this, is, so here's the full scan. This is how the time to scan the image essentially, or pixel. This is noise, right, the peak signal to noise ratio of the resulting image. And what you see is, instead of scanning every pixel, it is actually advantageous to scan each pixel, or only 50, or every second, every third pixel, and do some reconstruction using AI technology. You actually end up with significantly improved quality of the image, which is somewhat counterintuitive, right? You scan less, but with higher accuracy, right? And then by filling in the right information using AI that has been trained on similar images, you can actually dramatically improve the performance. So doing less work is sometimes better, is the short form. This is not always, but it's still true here, not as well as if you just want to look at the entire resulting images, but here we actually do some segmentation on top of this, so there it doesn't work as well as over here, but still you get significant improvement. So just to wrap up, first of all, I think I've tried to tell you that, right, we actually need all of AI, not just deep learning, not just machine learning, but really learning and reasoning. I hope I convinced you that this combination of, right, learning models about the real world, setting up scenarios, simulating them is very helpful. So this idea of digital reality, which essentially you can boil it down into using AI to optimize and safeguard other AI systems. This continuous learning loop where you're continuously improving the system as you learn and get more information is really important, and there's a lot of high-performance computing involved in this. Then these smart sensors, which I didn't really talk about much about. So overall, still, while there's very promising results, I think there's a lot of work still ahead of us. So we have full job security for the next decade or two. We need to work much closer with industry. I think this is the big, right? I mean, we can Otherwise, we get stuck in what we're doing on the research side. I think there's really interesting challenges out there, for instance, in the autonomous driving, but many other areas as well. And we need to work much closer with the industry, and Claire tries to do and enable some of that. And so AI, we have a bright future, I would say. Thank you.
Thanks to our speaker, our guest, for this very interesting, I would say, fascinating and very clear talk. Are there any questions?
Yeah. So of course, that's what I said. This was the top arrow in this diagram that I had, right? This is the reasoning. But what scenarios do we need, and what scenarios would most help us, right? But I don't think logical reasoning will help us understand what are these very subtle changes in the motion of a pedestrian. I wouldn't see how we can even model that. The only way I see for doing this is doing deep learning, because we can't even describe these changes ourselves as humans. So it's something we have to learn from the data to be as accurate as possible. So at the end, it's really, as I try to argue, it's really the combination of reasoning for finding the different scenarios, combining them in ways that we know will generate interesting information at the end, and machine learning for instance, to accurately model the motion of the pedestrian. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, again, I'm not saying we only need one or only need the other. We need both of these aspects to model the world out there, which is what we need to train the AI system, right? We essentially need these people to run around in all of our scenarios, in order that we can generate exactly the situations where a critical event could happen. And there is a lot of reasoning that we need for that. There's a lot of machine learning and deep learning that we also need. Thank you. Walking or driving a bicycle is the same problem. Yeah, exactly. So there's actually a large project we're doing is interactive machine learning, right? So essentially exactly of learning from that interaction. And again, we can model a lot of that. So if we can model the behavior, and that is actually much more difficult than just modeling the motion, because behavior is something that's driven from your brain and something you cannot observe directly. So this makes the whole learning step much more difficult. But yeah, so there are cases where you really need that interaction, take that into account. But for the example where the kid running in front of the car, right, there essentially is no interaction. You have to see the kid as early as possible. You have to predict what that kid will be doing, and then have to make a decision, right? There's no, at some point maybe the kid will recognize the car and then it might react in ways that are unexpected, but hopefully by then you have seen the car, or the AI system has seen the car and has reacted already. So this interaction doesn't really play a role in this case. So you need to have made the decision already before the interaction or the mutual response actually has happened. So I think we have to deal with both cases. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, they have to build in redundancy, and they are. I mean, a lot of that is just chip technology. It's small, and once you design it, it's not that expensive. The biggest issue right now are these sensors. The sensors, particularly LiDAR sensors, radar less, but LiDAR is really expensive still. And you need redundancy on the sensor side, which is one of the arguments why you want cameras and LiDAR and radar, because if there's fog, your camera doesn't work, radar still works. So you really want to fuse these two and take the most information that you get from any of the sensors, and you get also redundancy in the process. So there is a lot of work in the car industry to make sure that there is redundancy, and they can be sure that under all circumstances they can make a good decision. Yes. Oh yes, of course. Yeah. And they have redundant braking systems in those cases as well. So they're taking a lot of that into account. But of course, there can always be errors that you can't recover from. That is possible. And they do a lot. I mean, one of the areas they're currently looking at is that at every point in time, they pre-compute a safe reaction. So if something fails right now and maybe they can't talk to the brake anymore, that they make sure that brake is disabled so it doesn't start braking unexpectedly, and that they have backup plans for how to stop the car, drive to the side of the road, and things like that. So there's a lot of work actually going. Yeah. Thanks. So first of all, I think it is further elaboration of this. I mean, we've started, let's just go back to this diagram here. We've started this as our general framework for a lot of the research we're doing, right? But this is the plan. This is not the solution yet. I mean, we're working on individual pieces on all four sides here, and of some of the basic technology supporting the whole approach. But there's plenty of work still to be done in this context. The other really big, so another really big story is explainable AI, from just debugging tools, know what is going on in these deep learning networks, to really try just looking at them in a way that we can, as humans, can understand that. And from my point of view, also this notion, or this really explainable AI. I mean, there's different forms of explainable AI. Is explained to the user, right? But also forms of how can we look into these deep, for instance, deep learning networks, to understand what's going on there and project this into a space, into a semantic space that we as humans can understand. But that's a different understanding than the end user. It's from the expert, right? It can look like in the inside. That's a really a huge step forward. But coming back to this 20, 30 years, so the one thing I keep saying to politicians now, and I think it's an interesting discussion and to have. So I would argue, and because you talk about young people joining the field, I would say from the AI that we will have in 20 or 30 years, we probably only know a couple of % of that at this point. It might be, I mean, it's very hard to measure that. Okay? But I would argue there's so many unknown areas where we know there is something out there, and there's probably more thing behind that. So whether it's 5% or maybe 10%, maybe it's more. But the point is, we don't need to run after, like everyone says, China and US is somewhere in front of us and we need to catch up. No, we need to turn left and right and top and bottom to explore those unknown areas and then be leaders in those fields. Yes, and maybe we can catch up, by the way, as well. But I think, and we are actually, we have excellent education. We have some of the best people, except that a lot of them don't stay in Europe, but they actually are hired by the US and sometimes China. So I think we should really focus on that, and that requires funding for doing these things and these big. We're very good at doing incremental research. What we're not good at, because and there is no funding for that either. So we don't even, many of us don't even start thinking about that. Is what are the next big thing, and I think that's what we need to focus on. Sorry for my lamenting.
Well, we thank the speaker not only for the technical contribution, but for the wide picture that he has been able to make. Now our president will close.
Want to use the mic? I hope it works.
I'm looking at this picture and I think about the discussion about the good effect of artificial intelligence and the bad effect. Some people say it will increase our wellness. Some people say it will increase the inequality. I think we have a big problem because we have not a scenario, we have not a good model of society, of economic and environment, and we need to apply, for me, this kind of tool, this kind of paradigm in a wide problem is our survival as a humanity. And I think for this we need such kind of paradigm, using also scientists from different fields and together to study, because we don't know the context in which we are living. So it's impossible to speak about ethical impact without knowing the model of the reality.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for...
Yes, thank you very much, Pierre. And now it's time to close this section. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Our
It's a very interesting and very good thing. We're actually starting to do something in this direction. Thank you. But I'm still around today, so we can talk offline. Thank you.